Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. This episode, we're talking to Corinne Zupko about her book, From Anxiety to Love, a radical new approach for letting go of fear and finding lasting peace. Welcome to the podcast, Corinne.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
The first thing we want to ask you is what inspired you to write this book? Your own personal experiences with anxiety, as well as your professional experiences. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was pretty much born anxious. I received my first psychiatric diagnosis at the age of 2 of separation anxiety disorder. And I was always an anxious child, but once I got to college, things got really intense for me because that was the time when I broke down with really debilitating anxiety and panic attacks. And those were triggered by the death of a student on campus. I didn't know this student, but it was a very sudden death and it really freaked me out. So after I learned that news the next morning, I woke up at about 3 o'clock in the morning in an all-out sweat. My heart was racing. I thought I was dying. And it turns out it was my first panic attack. And I was then for years with out of the blue, uncontrollable panic attacks, a high degree of anxiety. And it was really through the help of a number of things, including counseling, including talking a lot with my mom, because she was really a true spiritual mentor for me. But the thing that helped me the most was a spiritual pathway called A Course in Miracles. And through all those things, I found my way into really wanting to give back. I ended up becoming a therapist and working with one-on-one clients for many years, but I still had some degree of anxiety that sort of followed me. And in 2009, I went through another really debilitating episode of anxiety and when I say debilitating episode, I mean like I couldn't function. Like it was hard for me to get off the couch. My stomach was in such a physical knot that it was hard for me to eat because it was just like spasming and it was at that point that I like really started diving in deeply to my spiritual practice and I started finding relief. I started noticing that a lot of my anxieties and my fears were falling away. And I knew at that point in time, I had to start writing what was helping me. And the results over a total of 6 years, it took me to write the book. The result are in the pages of From Anxiety to Love. So that book comprises a lot of the principles and spiritual practices that help me in recovery.
I think that's great that you're sharing what worked for you. I feel like so many people, I believe you even stated in your book or it was in the PR materials that it was 18% of adults have anxiety, and I definitely have seen that in my life. I've had anxiety. Spencer's had anxiety.
Yep.
Most of my best friends have had anxiety and panic attacks. It's just so many people have that now, and it's good to see how people can get through that for ways that work for them that help them in healthier ways. It seems like there's just so many people on these anti-anxiety drugs right now.
Yeah, my experience, I was on anti-anxiety medication, and my experience was that it didn't really help, except in the sense that I slept, that the medication made me drowsy, and so I was asleep, and when I was asleep, I wasn't having a panic attack. But I had no relief from the anxiety or from the panic attacks while I was conscious. It just knocked me out, and I slept 18 hours a day and gained 60 pounds in 18 months or something like that, and just, basically just slept my life away and, wasn't anxious because I was asleep. I think it's really interesting that your spiritual practice is what helped you recover from that, because that was actually something that I, in my own recovery process, hit upon, which is that one of the roles historically that spiritual practice has served is as a healing mechanism for, we would consider in the model world, like psychiatric disorders, and that as our society has moved away from religion and spirituality and started treating these all as like chemical imbalances that can be treated with medications with often limited effect. The argument I've made to a friend of mine who's pretty strictly atheistic is it doesn't really matter if it's real or not, if it helps you. Like, I do have my own spiritual beliefs, but for hundreds of thousands of years, humans use spirituality, and it was a coping mechanism. If you were upset or depressed or whatever, you'd go to your village shaman or whatever, and you'd have spiritual consultation and you would recover from it. Whereas in the modern world, that's become less and less emphasized. Now, people don't have that outlet and they go on a medication, they stay on that medication for years, and sometimes it doesn't even really help them.
Though I did like in your book that you did point out, and sometimes it is necessary to have the medication. I do feel it does help. It saves people's lives, certainly, in certain...
Definitely in crisis situations.
In crisis situations, yeah. guess.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought this point up about how society as a whole, that we've moved away from spirituality and have gone just to this strict medical model, because really, whatever your spiritual practice is, it's all about coming back into your being, like yourself, your true self, who it is that you are at your core. And however you conceptualize that, might be a little bit different. For me, I truly believe that love is at the center of everything. And so learning how to reconnect with that within myself and to trust that voice of love within me was huge, because just like you said, a pill, that's not going to take us into ourself. That's just like a Band-Aid, a temporary. For me, it was temporary, at least. I needed it during the very, very acute, debilitating time. But I trusted that my need for it would fall away as I was ready to let it go, as I really sort of did this, deep inner work, because a lot of my anxiety was very existential. Like, why the heck are we here? I mean, if God is love, how can all this crazy stuff be happening in this world? So I needed a spiritual remedy. There wasn't anything medically that could answer those questions for me.
I think that, that's definitely true. The spiritual, and don't want to be using the medications in order to hide from what's the core of the issue. You have to figure out what the core of the issue is. I had a friend violently attacked and had a horrible thing happen to her, and she ended up becoming addicted to her medications, to her benzodiazepine, because just the trauma was so strong. And we need to face those traumas head on, even though it hurt.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And that's where I love these like mindfulness-based practices, all about being with our experience, no matter what our experience is. Even if we are, having a flashback or some type of traumatic memory, that we're learning how to know that we can be okay, even despite the intensity of those feelings. So I agree with you that facing those things head on and not running from them, when we hide from it, that's just keeping it in the shadow to keep it from being healed. And it's all about bringing these things to the light.
That seems to be a common theme. We've talked to a lot of guests about that. We talked to Scott Stabile, who's also the same publisher, actually, and we talked a lot about that with him. And you mentioned in your book the idea of the spiritual bypassing, which is something we talked about with Scott Stabile.
And we talked about that with JP
Sears.
Oh, and with JP Sears in our first episode.
Yeah, I really think that that's such an important thing that we need to be aware of, because we can use our spiritual practice to just deny and to avoid and to just try to wish it away and make it, go. And one of the experiences that I talk about in my book is that I tried to do that. I mean, I've tried many ways, but one way in particular was that I used to have a challenging relationship with my dad, and it was really hard for me to speak up to him. And I was like, I'm just going to give this to the spirit. I'm hoping for a miracle. I'm willing to let it go. And nothing was changing. There was not a shift. I wasn't experiencing peace. Our relationship wasn't getting better. And finally I was like, you know what? I need to go through my lessons and learn how to talk to my dad and speak up. And now we have a good relationship as a result, because I needed to go through it and not tiptoe over it. We want to tiptoe over those painful parts. And like we're saying, we need to be able to be with them and face them.
It's interesting. We've had this discussion too on previous episodes. We've mentioned opiates and the opiate epidemic in this country. It seems to be even related to that, as we're so adverse to pain and facing these things head on that we'll do anything to numb ourselves.
Yeah, there's a real strong culture of avoiding discomfort at all costs and dealing with hard issues, whether it be social issues or personal issues or physical pain, that, everything is expected to be comfortable and easy. And if it's not comfortable and easy, then there's something wrong. I'm more conscious of it when it comes to large scale social issues, because there's a lot of really pressing problems in our society. And this is the context in which we first discussed spiritual bypassing with JP Sears, is that an individual can go and meditate and become mindful and feel really good and blissed out about themselves and everything's hunky-dory, but that ignoring those larger injustices in the world doesn't make them go away. And that actually came up for him, because I've had people say that to me, that when I talk about, social injustice or this or that issue, that they seem to think that talking about it is making it happen. And it's like, not talking about child abuse or not talking about, domestic violence or whatever doesn't make it go away. Like, it is very much happening. Like, you can put yourself in a little happy bubble and isolate yourself from it and meditate all day long and drink chai tea, but those things are still happening in the world. And for me, I think that as you become a more enlightened, spiritually strong person, one of the things that you're kind of obligated to do is to take that strength and go help remedy those injustices, not just further ignore them. But that's kind of anathema to where our society's at right now, because we're just avoiding talking about the things that are uncomfortable. We just don't cover the local issues in our hometown in the local paper. Well, then our hometown's great. People want to move here because it's so great. If you talk about these things, then you can solve the problem.
Right.
I was going to say the first thing to resolve the problems is people need to work on their own problem first.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of, how many societal problems would go away if people, like you said in the book, like not to identify yourself, like I am Janae, I am this, I am that, and start to see yourself as the larger self versus the little self.
Yeah, that larger self, that love that we all share. And I just really resonate with this conversation because I really feel like not talking about things is dangerous. And to bring it back to this example of anxiety, I thought, and everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people who really struggle with anxiety, it makes you feel like you're the only one in the world that feels this. And when I started talking about this, when I was like, all right, I'm coming out with this and publicly, so many people I knew from, oh my gosh, Corinne, me too. And it turns out they were just as good at hiding it as. And that was really surprising to see how we do have this culture of silence. And I want to hope that that's shifting with just the, hands up and the Me Too movement, and that I feel like some things are definitely changing, which is absolutely beautiful, but the avoidance of talking of it is problematic because it just keeps it in the shadow, and we need to bring it out into the light for healing.
Yeah, it's one thing to stop personal healing, but I still struggle with anxiety to some extent, and not nearly as bad as it was a few years ago, but I still have it. I'm not going to stop working on the bigger issues until I solve until I'm, walking around like Siddhartha all day long. Like, I very much think that having a dialogue is a big part of the process. That I had a family member who used to describe it this way. She said that, you see sometimes like there'll be a big family where they've got, 12 kids and all the nieces and nephews and cousins and everything, and they'll have like a big family reunion. And in a family reunion with 70 people, there's probably some kind of abuse going on somewhere. And when you go to a family event like that and everybody's just got a plastic smile plaster on, everything's fine, everything's perfect, you just know that everything's not perfect. And that the fact that people aren't talking about what may be going on is what allows it to go on. Just discussing it and putting it out in the open, as uncomfortable as that may be at first, prevents it from happening as much anymore. And that as a society, the more we talk about these things, like the quicker we'll be able to solve them. There's a really common mindset that I've seen a lot, where it's just people are like, well, you can't change the world. This is how the world is. Well, the world hasn't always been how it is now, and it's not always going to be that way. So you can change the world, and these are the small little things that each individual can do to change things a little bit at a time. Some of these movements are going on in society. It gives me hope that some of those things can be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to just go back for a moment to what you said about getting started, that, we don't have to be perfect before we take some sort of action. We can learn in that action. I actually teach graduate classes at the College of New Jersey in counseling. And one of the stories that I like there when we begin our exploration about advocacy in counseling is a story about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and how when he began, I think it was a gentleman by the name of Edgar Nixon, if I'm remembering correctly, who was the first to pull together some leaders in the community after Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. And he was the original organizer of this bus boycott. And he said, I want to nominate you, King, to be in charge. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as well as some of the other people in the room, were terrified. They were like, we don't know if this is a good idea. Nixon blew up and said, when are you going to stop acting like scared little boys and, stand up for this issue? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, yes, I'll step up here. But he was scared. He wasn't confident. He was getting death threats. He was terrified. But it was only after he saw however many thousands of poor and working class Black individuals do without public transportation for a year. Once he saw that, he was profoundly changed. So the fear and all the unreadiness that he felt in the beginning, melted away, and he found his calling. So I just love sharing that example with my class because it speaks to the fact that we don't have to be perfect before we step into a role of advocacy. We can do both. We can learn, as we step out and speak up. And that's part of our learning process.
Well, that's a good point. And if we wait till we're perfect to do anything, we'll never do anything. We'll just stay where we are.
Yeah, that's when I'm talking about like social issues or something on social media, I don't want to say it's happened a lot. It's happened a few times that people have been like, oh, well, you're not perfect, so you can't say anything. It's like, no, that's nonsense. I've had traffic tickets and occasionally I jaywalk. Like that doesn't mean I'm okay with, child labor in Indonesia. Nobody's perfect. That doesn't mean you should ignore like really gross, large scale social problems or,
that's what he is without then cast the first sound argument.
I think that's nonsense. And I think that's a nonsense that's propagated by people who profit from those kind of large scale injustices, is that one of the ways that they they silence dissent is by saying, oh, you're not perfect. I may be running a sweatshop in Indonesia, but you have such and such personal issue, so you can't criticize me. And I think that's nonsense. Everybody's got flaws, and there's no reason that we shouldn't be working for a better world.
Mm-hmm. I like that in your book you use the term inner therapist. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. So this inner therapist is a part of our very own mind that heals, that remembers the truth that we are all united, that we are made of love. In A Course in Miracles, which, my book, Principles of A Course in Miracles, that really resonated with me in helping me with anxiety. And, that's sort of what is infused throughout my book. The Course in Miracles calls your inner therapist your inner teacher, Holy Spirit. You can call it higher mind, your inner guide, or your inner guidance system. So it doesn't matter what you call it, but it's the idea that there's something outside of this limited, fearful thought system that we all know so well. And as we get connected with this part of our own mind, with our inner therapist, we are able to use it for healing. So for instance, this topic of just bringing things out into the light, being honest about them, confronting them, talking about them, that means we're honest with as well. We own our stuff and can turn toward this part of our mind, our inner therapist, and say, hey, you know what? I just noticed some really yucky, judgmental, or some really icky, fearful, anxious thoughts that just flew through my mind. Rather than bury them and deny that they're there, I'm willing to bring them to the light. I'm willing to see them differently. And this process that I write about in my book is about your willingness to do differently and bringing your willingness to your inner therapist, to your inner teacher, asking for a miracle, which is this sort of shift in perception, this ability to perceive and to experience love again, to hand it over and then to just trust that you handed it over and that shift is going to come when you're ready to receive it. So this inner therapist for me has been a key part, because as I've gotten better and better at listening to it, which I also call the voice of love, that's another way of thinking about your inner therapist, is the voice of love or your intuition within you. The more I've come to identify with that, the more I've found that my anxiety issues just fall away, because I feel so connected to my sense of being and the divine love that's within me.
One thing that I thought of when you were talking about that is I used to have like a lot of road rage, and I'd be in the car and somebody would cut me off, and I'd shake my fist at them, and I'd be screaming obscenities in my car. At a certain point, I just kind of looked at myself and I was just like, they're not even hearing it. My blood pressure's up and I'm angry, and I'm going to be angry for the next 15 minutes because of this. Maybe they're cutting you off because they're a jerk, but maybe I should have a little compassion. Maybe they really have to pee and they're trying to get over to the side of the road really quick, or they just got bad news on the phone, so they're trying to get home really quick. Have a little compassion. And like, I found that I'll still have just a moment of anger if somebody cuts me off in traffic, but I'll just go back to that. And over the last like 10 years or so, I've gotten to the point where I just don't really get road rage anymore. Maybe I get to my destination 10 seconds slower. It's not really a big deal. I just kind of roll along and just try and let stuff go. And it really felt like that was kind of like that inner therapist that like that was the voice telling me this is not a healthy behavior. The only person this is affecting is you and the person who's in the car. It's definitely not when you get into giving people the finger or yelling out of the car at them or chasing them down so you can shoo them out or whatever. God forbid, it even escalates to something further, as road rage cases do. All that really ultimately hurts you. That inner voice that was telling me that this is something I needed to work on for myself is very much in keeping with what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I love that example, because it is, when we're in those road rage situations, it is just your blood pressure that is at stake here. And so I love how you just said that, because it's so true. It is ultimately about releasing those feelings for ourselves, because they're not healthy. So I love that. It's beautiful.
It's interesting when you're just talking about anxiety in the same vein. Really, who are you hurting when you're anxious? You're really just hurting yourself. It's generally, it's not helping you, but it is, I believe you mentioned it in your book, or maybe another book I read about it. Someone suggested, why are you anxious? Because you're trying to protect yourself in some way.
Well, you were talking yesterday, you were saying that maybe one of the reasons why we are so anxious and so unable to handle discomfort these days is because our lives have gotten so easy.
Yeah, sometimes I think that.
Things are so easy and they're so comfortable, and there's, you just, when you compare the average lower middle class person or even poor person in America today, we live a pretty luxurious life compared to humans in any other point in history. I mean, you eat whatever you want, whenever you want, you go to sleep whenever you want. We have to work and, we have to do stressful things, but like, generally speaking, we got it pretty good compared to most of human history, and that maybe some of that anxiety is literally literally, because your brain is like evolutionarily has evolved to be dealing with saber-toothed tigers and warring tribes and all this chaos all the time. And, we have these really kind of sedentary, bland lives, and your brain's just like looking for reasons to be in fear, because historically we would have been in fear all the time.
You're reminding me, I was really, really fortunate to spend an evening with a Buddhist monk who was visiting in New Jersey and doing a little bit of a tour. And I was able to attend a workshop with him, although he's been in the States for probably 15 years or so. And he was saying, you don't realize here in this country, in the States, how comfortable you have it, how many luxuries you have. And as you were just talking, I was just thinking of that, because he was just saying, like, you have so many comforts. And in Sri Lanka, he said that he realized that, pregnant women who are giving birth, they don't have any comforts that we have here. And so he does fundraisers to raise money for babies in Sri Lanka. And he raises money for incubators, for preemies. He calls them toasters, which I just thought was so cute. But the point being, he said that he's like, when I do, meditation workshops with groups of people, everybody in the circle here in this country, they're all happy. Everybody's smiling. And then when I start the individual interviews with each participant, everybody's crying and they're so sad and they have all these problems. And he said, nobody talks about things here. You have so many comfort in your country, so many luxuries, and yet you're not the happiest country in the world. You're not the happiest country at all. And so what you were just speaking about reminded me of that we do have it pretty good. And yet there's this void that many of us feel where we have a lot of the things around us, but it's this emptiness that we feel inside. Ultimately, that happiness and that peace can only come from within and come from without. So like we talked about in the beginning of our interview with just, I forget our exact words, but it was just reminding me of how pulled inside of ourselves, we are, that we've gone away from spirituality and just into, medicine. We need to come back to ourself and slow down and pay attention and do one thing at a time and appreciate, the taste of our food instead of just like rushing it down to try to get on the next thing. And I really believe that it's in these tiny moments of tuning in and getting present that we can find that satisfaction again. And I'll add to that he said in Sri Lanka, in his country, he was like, when you have a problem, he's like, we go to everybody. Like, here, I have this problem. What do you think I should do about it? Help me. It's that collectivist culture. And he was just reflecting on how much it struck him that in our society, we keep it quiet. We put that happy face on and, don't really let others know what's really going on. So that was very striking for me.
And I'm sure that plays right into the level of anxiety in our culture, because people are anxious because they think there's something wrong with them, that they're weird or something.
Yeah, it seems really ludicrous to me that, as I was recovering from being really anxious and depressed, a few years ago, and I got a new apartment, and had my own furniture for the first time in a while, and had a computer and a desk and a bed and, Netflix. And I had really had this very comfortable life. I lived a very Spartan life for several years. And even now I'm very minimalist with how much stuff I want to acquire anymore. I was still somewhat anxious and depressed. And, a friend of mine he's like, you have this, you have this, you have this, you have this. How can you be anxious and depressed? And I'm like, well, because I don't have a community. I don't have like friends around me. I'm in a new place. I don't know people. It seems absurd to me. And most people live like this, that you are supposed to have an apartment that you live in by yourself. And most of your time is spent sitting at a computer screen, watching TV, not interacting with the community, not having love and affection around you or family members. We've compartmentalized often. We lead these very isolated lives, and humans never have lived like that in all of history. And then when we're anxious and depressed, as a result, we chemically replace all the oxytocin and, all the good chemicals that you got from interacting in a positive way with other humans with pills. It's not really the same. There is to me, a qualitative difference between an antidepressant and a loving relationship. Maybe on some kind of basic chemistry level, it's similar to what goes on in your brain, but it's really not the same. And I think consciously, it's not the same. So, a lot of people, they're on antidepressants, but they're still depressed. They feel not depressed. They don't feel lethargic when they take the pill, but it doesn't actually solve the problem of them being isolated and alone and feeling unloved.
Well, that's the thing, too, is there's different types of depression and anxiety, different causes. Some people might be more predisposed genetically than others. Some might be just going through a rough time in their life, though.
Yeah. I was listening to something the other day, and they were talking about the novel idea of real human relationships and interaction being a treatment for depression. I'm like, and that's really I think one of the key stumbling points that we're at is that from the scientific community's perspective, anything spiritual spiritual is superstitious, and there's a lot of they confuse religious ritual and dogma and doctrine with what Rabbi Rami, one of our podcast guests, calls perennial wisdom. The way I explain it to my one friend who's strictly atheist is it doesn't matter if this is literally true that when I pray I'm talking to a God who's a divine being. The point is that it helps. I do believe that it's real. It does help me, but a very key component of the human experience, and for a very, rational-minded, engineer-minded neuroscientist or a computer scientist, rational, that's not logical. You can't believe that. There's no proof. You're missing the point. But those scientific people are the people who are they're engineering our society, and they are dictating to all the people who do need those spiritual things to feel whole, like, no, you can't believe in that. That's nonsense. And I think that's really toxic process going on, that there needs to be a understanding that it's okay to let people believe those things and use them to help them with anxiety and whatnot. I think Sam Harris, the guy I always reference, he's one of the famous atheist thinkers, said, well, you can't justify, the transubstantiation and Catholic doctrine that they literally believe that the wafer is turning into the body of Christ in their mouth. That may be a far-fetched concept for someone, but if believing that helps that person, then let them believe it, is my position.
I totally agree. I feel like that says a lot too with our ability just as individuals and as a society too to keep an open mind that we are all on our different pathways. We are all, we have our different beliefs. It's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And so can we just accept each other and, where we are at and our different experiences? And I think we'd see a lot more harmony for sure. And just to mention science too, and I don't feel at all qualified to speak intelligently about quantum physics, but it is a branch of science. I feel like spirituality and science come together because from these little bits and pieces of these fascinating studies and things that I've heard, they might say that, no one has actually proved yet that matter even exists. It's just these collections of these electrons and, things spinning that don't actually ever other. And so I'm always fascinated when I learn from folks who are knowledgeable about quantum physics, because to me, it's that place where spirituality and science come.
It totally feels like we're learning more and more about these things we don't understand, or the things that we just thought were spiritual. We talked to Ken Wilber recently too. His theory is the integral theory, and it just seems like we're coming more and more to that point where we're seeing how everything is related.
Yeah, well, you look at a lot of the ancient spiritual teachings in Hinduism and Buddhism and Zen and Taoism, and there's been numerous physicists who became interested in that stuff in their later lives because they were finding that rules of nature that they were decoding sounded an awful lot like Taoism or sounded an awful lot like Zen. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I think it's mostly a 17th, 18th, 19th century Eurocentric racism, Eurocentric superiority that made us characterize those schools of thought as not scientific, because they were very much contemplative. They were sitting down and conducting thought experiments the same way Einstein did thousands of years ago, and I think said many times that it does those cultures a great disservice to just assume that people just 1795 were just all of a sudden smart, and everybody who from any other culture, any other time in the world going back thousands of years, they were just idiots. They were just superstitious cavemen, and that's been a largely discredited view anyway, but we still kind of have retained that we don't view Taoism as scientific thought because it didn't come from the Western scientific tradition, but they very much were trying to look at the world in their own way, describe it, and just because they didn't use European words, they didn't use Latin and Greek terms to describe what they were seeing, it's not regarded as real science.
Well, even a lot of this goes to vocabulary. Like, for example, in your book, you use the term the inner therapist, but we also could say the universe or the Holy Spirit, like you mentioned. I mean, it's so much of this terminology people get caught up in.
Yeah, that's something that what Rami was saying basically is like it's all vocabulary. You know, it really depends what your native tongue is. He was raised Jewish, so he uses primarily the language of Judaism, but it's all really kind of the same thing.
Yeah. I love that. We really do get so caught up in semantics when if we can just drop beneath words to the meaning behind the words and see past the semantics, I think, we're going to be speaking much more of a common language across the board in many ways.
Speaking of that, you mentioned meditation in your book. You have meditations in your book. Meditation really is a key, I think, to finding that, and people who meditate will realize that when they talk to each other, they're having a similar experience mentally.
So true. Yeah, I am a big fan of meditation. There's an ease in my experience that comes about when you're trying to to change or overcome or work on something, that there's sort of this striving, this forcing, this grasping of wanting to get that thing, get that experience, get that mind state. And with mindfulness meditation in particular, it's all about not striving. It's all about being with our experience and allowing things to be as they are. And I've just found in my experience that the more I have come into that place of always quiet, because we can talk about, all the crazy things that come up in the mind when you just sit and close your eyes, because it's like that monkey mind, it jumps from one thing to another. I feel like that has helped me take big steps forward in releasing anxiety and a lot of the issues that I used to live with, because of my willingness to go sit my butt down on a cushion. So that's been a huge piece for me. That's been so super helpful.
Yeah, that's Sam Harris is also, it's been really interesting. I've been listening to his podcast for about a year now, and he comes from he's a neuroscientist, and he comes from this very rigidly scientific view, and he discovered mindful meditation some years ago. He feels like he's describing all the same things that people from the spiritual community describe. He's saying he's still criticizing religion, and he still views himself as an atheist, and then he describes his experience of meditation, and as a spiritual person, I say, yes, exactly. Like, exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Going back to the vocabulary.
He's saying, no, there's nothing spiritual about it. And I'm saying, no, like exactly what you're describing is exactly what spiritual people are trying to say. The vocabulary, the semantics you're arguing over, whether or not this is a phenomena of your mammalian brain or whatever, but the experience of the loss of ego. And he's even talked about the sense of oneness that he feels opposed to losing yourself and feeling nothingness, which is one experience people describe in meditation. He says that he feels like a sense of great oneness, feeling that you're kind of one with everything. And that's something I experienced for the first time. When I meditated in the past at first, and I meditated since I was a teenager, it was always arising. Things were arising. That monkey brain was jumping from one thing to the next and worrying and worrying. And then I went to a Sikh temple a few years ago, and I sat down and I didn't know what to do, because they have their stand up, sit down, sing along stuff that they do. And so I just sat down and meditated and closed my eyes, and I meditated, and then I opened my eyes, and it was an hour and a half later. I have no idea. I had this tremendous feeling that like I was in a room with a lot of people talking at me, and then I went somewhere else, and then somebody touched me on the arm, and it was an hour and a half later, and it felt like it had been 10 seconds. It was the most bizarre experience I've ever had meditating. And I was like, whoa. And like when Sam Harris was describing his, I was like, yes, exactly. Like, isn't that weird? Like you can try and explain it with science, and you can try and explain it in a bunch of different ways, but the truth is like science really doesn't know what's going on there. Science doesn't understand consciousness, and disregarding 6,000 years of philosophy and spiritual practice as a way of understanding consciousness is kind of egotistical of modern science.
I was just going to say, you offer suggestions for people in the book who aren't familiar with meditation. The guided meditations is a great way for people who aren't familiar with it, or who don't think they can sit that long. And the idea of being mindful while you're doing things is really, I think, important to alleviating anxiety.
Yeah, I came to meditation from martial arts actually originally, and that's the secret to martial arts that I try to explain to people is that you go into martial arts as a kid because of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but the actual physical practice of martial arts or yoga forces you into a meditative state while you're doing something, and it's almost impossible not to meditate while you're doing something when you're doing something like that. People think to meditate you have to sit on a cushion, and it has to be quiet, and it has to be a dark room, and you have to isolate yourself from all stimuli, whereas I actually have come more advanced I get at meditation, the more I can bring myself into that state when I'm working, when I'm playing, whatever I'm doing.
And that's the beauty of our mindfulness practice, is that it's not meant to be only that thing that you have to go do for 10 minutes, like you said, in that dark room on a cushion. This is a way of living our life. And so if you think about it, our human brains can only do one thing at a time. Multitasking is actually a myth. It's been shown through a lot of this research with brain studies looking at mindfulness-based interventions that we can literally only do one thing at a time. What we do is we switch tasks. We jump from one thing to another to another. With bringing this practice into our daily life, it really becomes about focusing on one thing at a time. With the martial art example that you just gave me, it made me think about how that's mindfulness in motion, where you're fully in your experience, you're focused, you're in that flow. And I know many of us have had that experience of being in flow if we're working or drawing or making music, where you just sort of lose that sense of time. We can practice being in that presence when we're washing our dishes or brushing our teeth, or even dragging the garbage can out to the curb, just by listening listening to the wheels and feeling, your hand on the handle and pulling it down the driveway. It's about really slowing down and just experiencing one thing at a time, trying to bring your mind to that, because the mind will wander. If we don't purposefully bring our attention to what we're doing, it'll go off in 1,000 different directions. That's just what it does.
I find one of my most Zen practices is shoveling snow. So as this blizzard descends on Chicagoland, it's an opportunity for me to go do my practice. That's one of the most pleasurable things in my life lately has been shoveling snow. It's just a very, like, you're doing one thing. There's a very specific thing. It's, I put music on in my headphones or whatever, and I shovel snow, and I'm just as happy as a clam. But, when I'm in my other job, I have to, when we have a snowstorm, I have to go out and shovel. I'm like, yes! I get to shovel snow.
That's awesome. I love that. Yep, that's definitely a meditation practice, no doubt.
Before we finish today, I'd like to ask you, Corinne, do you have any other projects? Your book is From Anxiety to Love, and you have the From Anxiety to Love website and podcast as well. Is there anything else you're working on or like to share with us?
Yeah. So in the book, I offer a number of different meditations for different anxiety-provoking scenarios, and I'll be releasing the From Anxiety to Love meditations very shortly. They'll be out and available. Perhaps by the time that you're listening to this, it's going to be on iTunes and Amazon. And I'm super excited about those because just reading a meditation in a book doesn't necessarily help you have that experience because you have to read it and comprehend it and then do it. So they're set to just beautiful music. And I'm super, super excited about offering that CD as well.
You said those will be on iTunes and Amazon. Where can people get your book?
It's available anywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can ask for it anywhere and find it online. So I'm super grateful and honored to be able to share it with everybody and hope that it will be truly helpful.
And where can people find you on social media?
I hang out a lot on Instagram. I love doing little mini blogs on my photos. So Instagram and Facebook as well. I hang out there a lot.
And that's at
Instagram, I'm Corinne Zupko.
Okay.
And on Facebook, it's czupko.acim. So if you just typed in Corinne Zupko, I'd come up in search results.
We'll link to all those on our blog article on the website so people can find you.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yes, thank you,
Thank you
Corinne.
for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You
Thank
too.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER. Or call 630-492-0831.